In a world where power and success are often reserved for the privileged few, Jacqueline Harper, a black woman who climbed her way to the top, knows what it's like to fight for every inch. But as she takes control of a company steeped in corruption, she discovers something more dangerous than greed, deep-seated racism that threatens to undo everything she's built. With enemies on every side, will Jacqueline break the chains that have held her back, or will she become a casualty in a battle that's far more personal than she ever imagined? The city stirred awake with its usual symphony of sounds, subways rumbling beneath the streets, distant honks of impatient taxis, and the rhythmic footsteps of joggers cutting through the crisp morning air in Central Park. Above it all, the golden hues of dawn stretched lazily over the Manhattan skyline, casting everything in a warm glow. Amid the towering buildings, one structure stood out, a sleek, glass-covered giant that caught the morning light like a mirror. Silver Rock Enterprises. Its name, etched in bold silver letters, reflected the kind of power that whispered exclusivity and control. Inside, the air was thick with an unsettling quietness, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Employees trickled in through the revolving doors, some clutching coffee cups, others adjusting ties, their faces wearing the same expression, focus laced with a trace of apprehension. The polished marble floors gleamed beneath their hurried steps, and the scent of fresh paper and faint cologne lingered in the space. At the heart of this meticulous corporate machine was Jacqueline Monroe. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling window in the executive suite on the top floor, staring out at the city below. Her silhouette was striking against the morning light, tall, poised, and commanding. Jacqueline wore a tailored navy blue suit, the cut emphasizing her sharp shoulders and the effortless confidence she carried. Her dark skin glowed faintly in the light, a quiet testament to the grace and power she embodied. In her hand was a steaming cup of tea, untouched. Jacqueline wasn't here for rituals. She was here for purpose. Her eyes weren't just looking out at the city. They were scanning it, as if deciding which part of the world she'd conquer next. A soft knock on the door broke her focus. She turned sharply, her gaze slicing through the room like a blade. Her assistant, Nina, a petite woman with nervous energy, stepped in hesitantly, clutching a tablet. "They're ready for you in the conference room," Nina said, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. Jacqueline placed the cup down with deliberate care. "Good." As she walked toward the door, her heels clicked against the polished floor, echoing like a metronome of authority. Jacqueline wasn't just entering a meeting. She was entering a battlefield. The conference room buzzed with tension. Around the massive oak table sat the key players of Silver Rock Enterprises, department heads, legal advisors, and the CEO, Richard Harland. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his lips curling in the kind of smirk that could start wars. Jacqueline entered without hesitation, her presence silencing the murmurs like a switch had been flipped. All eyes turned to her. She didn't sit. Instead, she stood at the head of the table, commanding the room with a single look. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice smooth but firm, "thank you for joining me this morning. I'll keep this brief." Richard's smirk widened, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "This company," Jacqueline continued, her gaze sweeping across the table, "is about to undergo changes. Big ones. And I'm here to ensure those changes happen efficiently and effectively." One of the managers, a middle-aged man with a receding hairline, cleared his throat. "Ms. Monroe, with all due respect, what exactly are these changes?" Jacqueline's eyes locked onto his, unblinking. "Accountability, Mr. Green. It starts at the top." A ripple of discomfort spread through the room. Richard straightened in his chair, the smirk fading ever so slightly. "Silver Rock Enterprises has a reputation," Jacqueline continued, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "But it's not the one you think. Behind these walls is a culture of negligence, arrogance, and, frankly, discrimination." She let the last word hang in the air, heavy and damning. Richard shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tapping against the table. "These are bold accusations, Ms. Monroe," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Do you have evidence to back them up?" Jacqueline smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. She pulled a folder from the slim briefcase she'd carried in and slid it across the table. It landed in front of Richard with a quiet thud. "See for yourself," she said simply. Richard opened the folder, his face darkening with every page he turned. Inside were detailed reports, testimonies, and damning emails, evidence of systemic racism within the company's management, including his own complicity. The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. No one dared to speak. Jacqueline took a step closer to Richard, her voice dropping to a dangerous softness. "I didn't come here to debate, Mr. Harland. I came here to fix what's broken, and that starts with you." Richard's face twisted in anger, but before he could respond, Jacqueline turned to the rest of the room. "You have two choices," she said, her voice rising with authority. "You can either be part of the solution, or you can get out of my way." The silence was deafening. Then, one by one, the department heads lowered their gazes, their loyalty to Richard evaporating in the face of Jacqueline's resolve. Richard stood abruptly, slamming the folder shut. "This is outrageous," he barked. "You think you can just waltz in here and—" "I don't think," Jacqueline interrupted, her tone icy. "I know." She stepped back, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. Effective immediately, Richard Harland is relieved of his duties as CEO of Silver Rock Enterprises. His behavior has not only tarnished his company's reputation, but has also put it at significant legal risk. Richard's face turned a shade of red that bordered on purple. "You can't do this," he spat. Jacqueline raised an eyebrow, her calm demeanor unshaken. "I just did." As security entered the room to escort Richard out, Jacqueline turned back to the table. "Let this be a lesson to all of you," she said. "Change is not optional. It's inevitable, and I will not tolerate anything less than excellence." The door closed behind Richard with a finality that echoed through the room. Jacqueline glanced at her watch, then at the stunned faces around the table. "Now," she said, her voice as sharp as ever, "let's get to work." The meeting ended, and the room emptied quickly, the employees retreating to their offices to process what had just happened. But Jacqueline lingered for a moment, standing alone by the window. She looked out at the city once more, her reflection staring back at her in the glass. This was just the beginning. The day moved forward with sharp efficiency, just as Jacqueline intended. Meetings, policy reviews, and strategy briefings fell into place like perfectly arranged chess pieces. Yet, even amidst her triumphs, there was an unease she couldn't quite shake, like a shadow lurking at the edge of her consciousness. By late afternoon, the sky had shifted to a dull gray, clouds thick and heavy, threatening rain. Jacqueline sat in her spacious office, her desk immaculate except for her laptop and a sleek black pen. Her assistant Nina had just left after delivering the latest updates, and for the first time that day, the room was still. She leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. The weight of the morning's confrontation lingered, but she knew it was only the beginning. People like Richard Harland didn't go quietly. The evidence she presented was airtight, but his kind always found a way to squirm. Her phone buzzed softly against the desk, pulling her from her thoughts. A message flashed across the screen. It was from an unknown number. "You think you're in control, but you don't know the half of it. Check your inbox." Jacqueline's heart didn't race. She had long trained herself to remain calm under pressure, but her fingers tightened slightly around the phone. She unlocked it and quickly navigated to her email. At the top of her inbox was a new message with no subject line. She clicked it open. Inside was a single attachment, a video file. For a moment, she hesitated. The sender's email address was an untraceable string of random characters, clearly someone trying to stay anonymous. A flicker of doubt crossed her mind, but she clicked the attachment. The video opened, and the screen filled with grainy, dimly lit footage. It took her a moment to understand what she was looking at. The room was small and cluttered, a far cry from the pristine offices of Silver Rock Enterprises. Two figures stood in the frame, their voices muffled at first, but as the audio sharpened, Jacqueline felt her stomach tighten. One of the men was Richard Harland. The other was someone she didn't recognize, a younger man, dressed in casual clothes, his face partially obscured by the angle of the camera. "I told you," Richard was saying, his voice dripping with disdain. "She's not going to stop until she burns this place to the ground. If she gets her way, people like us won't stand a chance." The younger man shifted uncomfortably. "But the files, if she finds out." "She won't," Richard snapped, cutting him off. "Unless you screw this up. You said you could handle it." The younger man nodded quickly, his movements jittery. "I can. I will." "Good," Richard said, his voice low and menacing. "Because if this backfires, it's not just your job on the line. Do you understand me?" The video ended abruptly. Jacqueline stared at the blank screen, her mind racing. The files. What files? And who was this man Richard had been speaking to? Before she could process further, her phone buzzed again. Another message from the same unknown number. "You're not as untouchable as you think. Be careful who you trust." For the first time in years, Jacqueline felt a chill run down her spine. The rain began to fall, soft at first, then harder, drumming against the windows of her office. Jacqueline stood, her hands resting on the edge of her desk as she stared out at the storm. She prided herself on her composure, her ability to face any challenge head-on. But this was different. This wasn't a battle she could fight openly, not yet. Nina returned a few minutes later, oblivious to Jacqueline's inner turmoil. "Ms. Monroe, your 6 o'clock is ready in the conference room," she said, her tone professional as always. Jacqueline turned, her face a mask of calm. "Cancel it." Nina blinked, surprised. "Cancel. But—" "Cancel it," Jacqueline repeated, her voice firm but not unkind. "And clear my schedule for the rest of the day. I need time." Nina hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. "Of course." She left quietly, leaving Jacqueline alone once more. That evening, Jacqueline sat in her penthouse apartment, the city sprawling beneath her in a glittering tapestry of lights. The video replayed in her mind, over and over, each frame etching itself deeper into her thoughts. She poured herself a glass of red wine, hoping to dull the edges of her unease, but it didn't help. Instead, her thoughts became sharper, more focused. Who had sent her the video, and why? Was it a warning, a threat, or both? Her mind wandered to her team, those she trusted to help her reshape Silver Rock. Could one of them be involved? The thought made her chest tighten. Trust had always been a fragile thing in her world, and this was a brutal reminder of why. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was Nina. "I know you said not to disturb you." Nina's voice was hesitant. "But there's something you need to see. It's about the company archives." Jacqueline's grip on the phone tightened. "What about them?" "There's been a breach," Nina said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Someone accessed restricted files earlier today. We don't know who yet, but IT is looking into it." Jacqueline's mind raced. The files. Could it be connected to the video? "I'll be there in 20 minutes, she said, already grabbing her coat. The Silver Rock building was eerily quiet when Jacqueline arrived, the rain now reduced to a faint drizzle. She made her way to the IT department, where a small team was huddled around a cluster of monitors. A young technician looked up as she entered, his face pale. "Ms. Monroe, we've isolated the breach. It happened just after lunch. Someone accessed sensitive personnel files and copied them onto an external drive." "Can you trace it?" Jacqueline asked, her voice calm but firm. The technician hesitated. "We're working on it, but whoever did this covered their tracks well. It's going to take time." Jacqueline nodded, her mind already moving to the next steps. She couldn't afford to wait for answers. As she left the IT room, her phone buzzed once more. Another message from the unknown number. "You're closer to the truth than you think. But some truths come with a price." Jacqueline stared at the screen, her jaw tightening. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to scare her. They were playing a game. And if there was one thing Jacqueline Monroe hated, it was being played. She squared her shoulders, her resolve hardening. Whatever game this was, she was going to win. The Silver Rock boardroom hummed with tension. The 12 members sat around the sprawling mahogany table, their faces a mix of curiosity, unease, and skepticism. The air seemed heavier than usual, thick with unspoken thoughts. Jacqueline stood at the head of the table, her presence commanding yet restrained. She wore her confidence like armor, every detail of her appearance flawless, from her tailored ivory suit to the pearl earrings that caught the light when she moved. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," she began, her voice smooth but edged with steel. "I've called this meeting because there's been a breach. Sensitive information has been accessed without authorization." A murmur rippled through the room. Eyes darted around, some wide with genuine surprise, others narrowing as if calculating how much she might know. Richard Harlan sat near the middle, leaning back in his chair with an air of nonchalance. His smirk was faint but deliberate, the kind of expression that dared someone to call him out. Jacqueline didn't glance at him directly, but she could feel his gaze lingering on her, a silent challenge. "Ms. Monroe," one of the older board members, Philip Andrews, spoke up, his brow furrowed. "Do we know what information was accessed?" Jacqueline met his eyes evenly. "Not yet. But rest assured, we're investigating. The integrity of this company is non-negotiable." Richard chuckled softly, just loud enough for everyone to hear. Integrity. That's quite a word, isn't it? The room fell silent. All eyes turned to him. Jacqueline tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Do you have something to share, Mr. Harlan?" He shrugged, leaning forward now, his elbows resting on the table. "Just an observation. Integrity's a nice thing to talk about, but in practice, it's a little more flexible. Don't you think?" A flicker of something sharp crossed Jacqueline's face. Anger, perhaps, but it was gone as quickly as it came. She smiled, a cool, calculated expression. "Integrity might be flexible for some," she said, her tone light but laced with a subtle edge. "But not for me, and certainly not for this company under my leadership." Her words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. The room grew even quieter, the tension palpable. Later that evening, Jacqueline sat in her private office, the city's lights sprawling beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Nina stood near the desk, holding a tablet with the latest updates on the breach investigation. "IT team narrowed it down," Nina said, her voice steady but tinged with unease. "The files that were accessed include financial reports and personnel records. But there's something else." Jacqueline looked up sharply. "What?" Nina hesitated. "A personal file. Yours." Jacqueline's stomach clenched, but she didn't let it show. "What was taken?" "We don't know yet," Nina admitted. "But whoever did this had a specific purpose. They weren't just fishing." Jacqueline leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. Her personal file contained details that could be used against her. Decisions made in the company's darker days, private correspondences, things that could be twisted if taken out of context. "Keep this between us," she said finally. "I don't want rumors spreading until we have all the facts." Nina nodded, her loyalty evident in the way she carried herself. But as she turned to leave, Jacqueline called her back. "Nina," she said, her tone softer now. "Have you noticed anything unusual among the staff or the board?" Nina hesitated again, her eyes flickering with something unspoken. "There's been whispers about Richard. Some of the staff think he's planning something, but no one has any proof." Jacqueline nodded slowly. "Thank you. If you hear anything else, let me know immediately." The following day, Jacqueline made it a point to observe her surroundings more closely. In the cafeteria, the casual conversations seemed to hush as she passed by. In the hallways, some employees avoided her gaze, while others watched her a little too closely. The atmosphere was shifting, and she could feel it. She made her way to the executive wing, where Richard's office was located. Without knocking, she pushed the door open. Richard looked up from his desk, a faint smirk playing on his lips. Jacqueline, to what do I owe the pleasure? She closed the door behind her, stepping into the room with deliberate calm. I thought we should have a little chat. Just the two of us. He leaned back in his chair, his expression one of mock amusement. I'm all ears. Jacqueline crossed her arms, her gaze steady. What are you up to, Richard? He raised an eyebrow. Up to? I'm not sure what you mean. Don't play coy with me, she said, her tone sharp. I know you've been scheming behind my back. The question is, how far are you willing to go? Richard's smirk widened. You give me too much credit, Jacqueline. If I wanted to take you down, you'd already know about it. Would I? She countered, taking a step closer. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're desperate. And desperate men make mistakes. For a moment, the air between them crackled with tension. Then Richard leaned forward, his smirk fading. You think you're untouchable, he said quietly, his voice low and dangerous. But everyone has a weakness. Even you. Jacqueline didn't flinch. And what's yours, Richard? Your pride, your ego. Or is it the fact that you've been coasting on mediocrity for years while the rest of us actually work? His eyes flashed with anger, but he didn't respond. Instead, he leaned back again, a cold smile curling at his lips. This isn't over, he said simply. Jacqueline turned and left without another word, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. That evening, Jacqueline met with Marcus, her longtime confidant and the company's chief legal officer. Marcus was one of the few people she trusted completely, his loyalty unwavering even in the face of adversity. They sat in her penthouse, the lights dimmed, and a bottle of scotch open between them. Richard's a snake, Marcus said bluntly, swirling his glass. But we've dealt with worse. What's really bothering you? Jacqueline hesitated, her walls momentarily slipping. Someone accessed my personal file. If the wrong information gets out, it could damage everything I've built. Marcus frowned. Do you think it's Richard? I don't know, she admitted, but he's certainly bold enough to try. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation settling over them. Finally, Marcus leaned forward, his expression serious. Jacqueline, you need to be careful. This isn't just about the company anymore. Whoever's behind this is playing a dangerous game, and they're coming for you. She nodded, her resolve hardening. Then I'll play back, and I'll win. Over the next few days, Jacqueline's world became a web of subtle moves and counter-moves. She worked tirelessly to uncover the truth, piecing together fragments of information while keeping up appearances as the company's unshakable leader. But the deeper she dug, the more she realized that the betrayal ran deeper than she'd anticipated. Someone close to her, someone she trusted, was feeding information to Richard. And whoever it was, they were playing both sides expertly, leaving no trace of their true allegiance. The tension continued to build, each interaction tinged with suspicion. Even Nina, who had always been loyal, seemed distant at times, her behavior slightly off. Jacqueline couldn't help but wonder if she, too, had been drawn into Richard's web. But Jacqueline Monroe was not a woman to be underestimated. She had built her empire on resilience and determination, and she wasn't about to let it crumble now. As the days passed, her plan began to take shape. A plan that would expose the traitor, outmaneuver Richard, and reclaim control of the company she had worked so hard to save. And when the time came, she would make sure that everyone involved understood one thing. Jacqueline Monroe was not someone to cross. Jacqueline stood before the full-length mirror in her penthouse, adjusting her blazer one last time before the board meeting. Her reflection stared back at her, sharp, calculating, and almost cold. Despite her outward poise, a storm raged beneath the surface. The investigation into the company's breach had led to a dead end, but she knew deep down that someone within Silver Rock was behind it. Whoever it was, they had access to not just corporate files, but personal ones, hers specifically. The silence of the room was interrupted by the ringing of her phone. She glanced at the screen, and her heart skipped a beat. It was Nina. Jacqueline had expected Nina to be at the office, keeping tabs on the investigation, but the call felt off. There was a strange urgency in Nina's voice when she answered. Jacqueline, Nina's voice broke off, followed by a sharp intake of breath. The tension in Nina's tone was unmistakable. Nina, what's going on? Jacqueline's heart rate quickened. I need you to meet me. Now. It's about Richard and… Nina cut herself off again, the urgency in her voice escalating. It's not what you think. Please, Jacqueline. Jacqueline's mind raced. What did she mean? What was she trying to say? Where are you? She demanded. I'll send you the location. Nina replied quickly, then hung up before Jacqueline could say another word. 30 minutes later, Jacqueline pulled into the secluded parking lot of a dimly lit warehouse just outside the city center. She didn't know why Nina had chosen this place. Too many shadows. Too much of an uneasy feeling about it. Jacqueline stepped out of her sleek black SUV and walked toward the entrance, every nerve in her body on high alert. She had trusted Nina, but now Jacqueline wasn't so sure. She entered the building and was immediately struck by the quiet, almost oppressive atmosphere. The only sound was the faint hum of fluorescent lights above her. It took her a moment to adjust to the darkness. The floor was cold under her feet, and the air smelled faintly of metal and dust. Nina. Jacqueline called out softly, her voice echoing in the hollow space. A figure emerged from the shadows at the far end of the warehouse. It was Nina, but she didn't look like herself. There was a hollowness in her eyes, and her usual confidence was replaced by something almost fearful. Nina, what's going on? Jacqueline asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the unease creeping up her spine. Nina motioned for her to follow, leading Jacqueline deeper into the warehouse. There was a dimly lit table ahead, where Nina had set down a file. Jacqueline couldn't make out what was inside, but the feeling of foreboding grew stronger as they neared it. Sit down, Nina said, her voice trembling. Jacqueline took a seat at the table, her gaze fixed on Nina as she opened the file. The first thing Jacqueline noticed were several photographs, pictures of herself, from different angles, at various locations. Most were taken in public, but some were more intimate. Nina, what the hell is this? Jacqueline's voice faltered. Nina swallowed hard, tears brimming in her eyes. I didn't want you to find out this way. But you need to understand, Jacqueline, you've been lied to. Richard isn't your enemy. I am. Jacqueline's heart stopped. For a moment, time seemed to slow. The world spun around her as her mind tried to process what Nina was saying. Her mouth went dry. What are you talking about? Jacqueline demanded, though her voice was barely a whisper. Nina hesitated, visibly conflicted. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. I've been working for Richard this whole time. I was the one feeding him information. I've been keeping tabs on you on your every move. Jacqueline stared at her in disbelief. What? You were working for him? Nina nodded, her face contorted with guilt. I never meant for it to go this far. I thought I could control it, but Richard's been more manipulative than I ever realized. He knew how to play me, Jacqueline. I thought I was doing the right thing, keeping your secrets safe, but everything's changed. Jacqueline's mind raced, but she couldn't form a coherent thought. Nina, the one person she had trusted more than anyone else, had been working against her this entire time. But why? Why betray me? Jacqueline asked, her voice cracking as the weight of it all began to settle in. Nina's eyes welled with tears. I was scared, Jacqueline. Richard promised me that if I helped him take you down, he'd help me take control of Silver Rock. He said I could be in charge, that I wouldn't have to stay in your shadow. He fed me lies. But now I see how wrong I was. She placed her hands on the table, the shaking evident in her fingers. I never thought I'd get this far, but I can't undo it now. Jacqueline stood up abruptly, anger surging within her like a tidal wave. You think you can just apologize and everything will be okay? That you can betray me and then turn around and ask for my forgiveness? Her voice was harsh, the edge sharp enough to cut through the thick silence. You were feeding him information. You were the one helping him destroy everything I've worked for." Nina's face crumpled in shame. "I never wanted this, Jacqueline. I thought it was just business, that I could handle it. But Richard's twisted, and I didn't know how to get out. I was too deep in." Jacqueline took a step back, trying to compose herself. But the sting of the betrayal hit her like a fist to the gut. She had always prided herself on her ability to read people, to trust those who had earned it. And now, the one person she thought she could trust had sold her out. "Why tell me now?" Jacqueline demanded, her voice hoarse. "What's changed?" "I couldn't live with it anymore," Nina said, her voice barely a whisper. "I see how far Richard's willing to go. If you don't stop him, he'll ruin you, and he'll take everything down with him. He's not just after the company, he's after everything. He's going to use whatever he has on you to destroy your reputation." Jacqueline clenched her fists. The information she had been protecting for so long, the darkest parts of her past that had always threatened to rise to the surface, were now at risk. Richard had known all along what buttons to press. He had used Nina to get to her. For a moment, Jacqueline just stood there, numb, before she finally spoke, her voice low and dangerous. "You don't get to walk away from this, Nina. You've already made your choice. But I'll make sure Richard pays for this." As Jacqueline left the warehouse, the weight of the betrayal settled on her shoulders like 1,000 pounds. She had to act fast. Nina's confession had only confirmed what Jacqueline had feared. The game was far more dangerous than she had realized, and Richard had been playing it with a level of strategy that had blindsided her. But this wasn't over. Not yet. Jacqueline had learned one thing. Trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. And now, it was time to turn the tables. Her plan was no longer about uncovering secrets. It was about survival. She would take down Richard, expose Nina for her role in the conspiracy, and make sure that Silver Rock remained hers. But this betrayal had opened her eyes to a new reality. Power was fragile, and in this world, everyone had a price. In the distance, the city's skyline glowed, casting a cold, indifferent light across the streets. But in Jacqueline's heart, a fire was beginning to burn, one that would consume everything in its path. The night air outside the penthouse was thick with tension as Jacqueline paced across the marble floor, her thoughts a chaotic swirl. Everything was slipping through her fingers. Nina's betrayal had rattled her to the core, but it was Richard's next move that had her on edge. She had known there was a coldness to him, an ambition that bordered on ruthlessness. But now, she was beginning to understand just how deep his calculations went. He wasn't just after Silver Rock anymore. He was going to destroy her. Jacqueline had always thrived on control, on knowing exactly what was happening around her. But now, the very foundations of her world were shifting. Every step she took to fight back felt like a step into the unknown, and that uncertainty gnawed at her. She grabbed her phone from a desk and dialed the number she had been avoiding all day, her lawyer, Adam. The call rang through, and after a beat, his familiar voice came through the line. "Jacqueline, you okay? Do I sound okay?" Jacqueline's tone was biting, a reflection of her mounting frustration. "Richard is planning something. I don't know what, but it's bad, Adam. I need your help." There was a pause on the other end before Adam spoke again, more cautiously. "What's going on?" Jacqueline ran a hand through her hair, trying to center herself. "I'm not sure yet, but I need to move fast. I need all the information we have on Richard. I want to know every deal he's made, every transaction that could tie him to this scandal. And I need it yesterday." "I can do that, but you're going to have to trust me on this," Adam said, his voice taking on a serious tone. "You're not just fighting Richard anymore. You're fighting the people he's got in his corner. There are powerful players involved, Jacqueline." "Who?" Jacqueline demanded. "Who exactly?" "I can't say yet, but you need to be careful. If you go after Richard head-on, you'll find yourself in a fight you can't win. The consequences will be far worse than you think." Jacqueline tightened her grip on the phone. She had heard this before, the warnings, the hesitations. Everyone around her was afraid, but not her. Not anymore. "I'm not afraid of Richard," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "I need the information, Adam. Get it to me as soon as you can." "All right. But be ready, Jacqueline. This is about more than just Silver Rock now. And I think you know it." With a final, lingering pause, Adam hung up. Jacqueline stood there for a moment, staring out at the city below her. The bright lights flickered like a million tiny stars in the night. But in her chest, there was no light, only darkness. The next morning, Jacqueline's thoughts were still clouded with the conversation from the night before. She hadn't slept a wink, too consumed by the looming war she was about to wage. As she walked through the corridors of Silver Rock's headquarters, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floors, she couldn't help but feel like a target. Her assistant, Lisa, was the first to approach her. She was carrying a folder, her face tight with concern. "Jacqueline, I think you need to see this," Lisa said, voice low and anxious. Jacqueline took the folder from her and flipped it open, scanning through the documents inside. They were news clippings, headlines from various financial reports. But one in particular caught her attention. Silver Rock's CEO faces legal trouble amidst major scandal. The accompanying article highlighted the legal battles Richard was already embroiled in, but there was something more. It mentioned an anonymous whistleblower, a source within Silver Rock, who had provided damning evidence against the company. The article hinted that the whistleblower could be connected to an ongoing investigation that could not only ruin Silver Rock, but also threaten Jacqueline's reputation. Her pulse quickened, and she slammed the folder shut. "Do you know who this whistleblower is?" Jacqueline asked, her voice like steel. Lisa looked at her, unease written all over her face. "No, but there's been talk around the office. People are worried. Some are even talking about a possible leak." Jacqueline's mind raced. Nina had been the only one with direct access to her, but she had no proof of Nina's involvement in this new leak. Was Richard using her again? Had Nina betrayed her again? Or had she simply been a pawn in a much larger game? "No one can know about this," Jacqueline said firmly, locking eyes with Lisa. "Not a word. I'll take care of it." She turned on her heel and walked toward her office, her heart hammering in her chest. Her every step felt like it carried the weight of the world. Outside the window, the city stretched out before her, but Jacqueline felt like she was trapped in a cage. The rest of the day was a blur of meetings, strategizing, and phone calls. Jacqueline worked tirelessly, putting together a plan to expose Richard, but she knew that the situation was quickly becoming more complicated. With every move she made, the walls seemed to close in around her. By the time evening rolled around, Jacqueline had a strategy in mind. It was bold, risky, but she had no other choice. Richard was a master manipulator, and to beat him, she would have to become one too. She called a private meeting with her trusted executive team, those who still stood by her, at Silver Rock's downtown offices. The glass walls of the conference room reflected the nervous energy of the group. Jacqueline stood at the head of the table, her eyes scanning the faces of her team. They all looked to her for guidance, but Jacqueline knew she couldn't protect them forever. She could barely protect herself. "There's a leak," she began, her voice steady but filled with a quiet fury. "And we have to find out who it is before it's too late." Her second-in-command, Ethan, looked around the room, his brow furrowed. "Are you sure about this? If we start pointing fingers, it's going to get ugly." "I'm not asking for accusations, I'm asking for action," Jacqueline replied. "We need to act fast. Trust no one outside of this room, and we need every angle covered. Adam is working on the legal side, and I'll need you all to dig through the company's internal communications. Find out who's been talking to the press." Ethan nodded, his expression serious. "Understood." Jacqueline sat down, her mind already racing ahead. Every minute counted, but as she stared at the group, one thought kept gnawing at her. What if she was already too late? That night, Jacqueline was once again alone in her office. She sat in the dark, the only light coming from the city skyline outside her window. She had been going over every piece of information she could gather, piecing together clues, trying to make sense of all. But nothing added up. Suddenly, The phone on her desk rang, breaking the stillness of the room. Jacqueline's hand trembled as she picked it up. "Jacqueline," Adam's voice came through, steady but with a hint of urgency. "I've got something. You need to hear this. Now." In the hours that followed, Jacqueline was thrown into a spiral of shock and disbelief. Adam had uncovered a financial transaction, an account linked directly to her, one that she didn't recognize, but which had been involved in some very shady dealings with Richard's associates. The weight of the revelation sank in, and for the first time, Jacqueline found herself questioning everything. She had been set up, framed, or worse, betrayed on a level she hadn't even imagined. But one thing was clear: the battle had only just begun. Richard wasn't just playing for power. He was playing for her downfall. And Jacqueline wasn't about to let that happen. In the silence of her office, Jacqueline felt her pulse quicken, the rush of adrenaline sharpening her senses. The world outside might have seemed calm, but she was no longer naive enough to believe that. It was war. The boardroom at Silver Rock felt colder than usual. Jacqueline's heels clicked against the polished floor as she strode toward the long, glossy table where her team was gathered, each of them tense and watchful. The room was dimly lit, the shadows from the city skyline creeping through the windows like silent witnesses to the battle that was about to unfold. Jacqueline knew this wasn't just another meeting. It was the moment of truth, the culmination of everything she had fought for, everything she had lost. Her eyes scanned the room. Ethan, who had always been her right hand, was sitting at the far end of the table, his posture stiff, his face unreadable. Lisa stood by the door, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. And at the other end of the table, Richard sat, unfazed, almost smug, as if he had already won. Jacqueline felt her pulse quicken. The weight of the situation pressed against her chest, but she refused to show it. She had prepared for this moment for weeks, and there was no turning back now. She had her cards, and Richard didn't know she was holding a royal flush. She placed a file on the table with a sharp snap, her eyes locking with Richard's. "You're done, Richard." The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Richard raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair with a predatory smile. "Is that so, Jacqueline? I think you're mistaken. You've been trying to take me down for months now. But look where we are. You're still here, and I'm still in control." Jacqueline's eyes narrowed. She had seen that smugness before, the false sense of invincibility that so many powerful men wore as armor. But she could feel the cracks in it now. She could see the way his jaw tightened, the flicker of unease in his eyes that he couldn't quite conceal. It was there, just beneath the surface. "This is over," she said again, her voice steady but filled with an icy resolve. "I have everything I need. Your secrets, your lies, your manipulation. They all come to light today." Ethan stood up abruptly, the tension in the room growing thick. He was the first to speak, his voice low, almost a whisper. "What are you talking about, Jacqueline?" Richard's gaze shifted to Ethan, and for the briefest moment, Jacqueline saw a flicker of recognition pass between them. It was subtle, but it was there, an unspoken connection, something more than just business. Jacqueline's mind raced. Could Ethan be involved in all of this? She had trusted him completely, but the weight of what she was about to reveal left no room for second-guessing. She had to trust that her instincts were right. "I've had enough of this game," Jacqueline said, her tone sharp now, a warning to them all. "I know about the offshore accounts, the kickbacks, the bribes you've been taking from Richard's associates. I know about the way you've been manipulating Silver Rock's finances to line your own pockets. And I know who you've been talking to behind my back." Ethan's face paled, and for a brief moment, his mask of composure cracked. "Jacqueline, you don't know what you're saying." "Don't lie to me," she shot back. "I have everything, every transaction, every document, every conversation." Richard stood up now, his chair scraping sharply against the floor as he faced Jacqueline. There was a dangerous gleam in his eyes, the once confident smile now replaced with something colder, more calculating. "You think you've won, don't you?" he said, his voice low, laced with venom. "You think you've got me cornered, but you're wrong. You don't have a clue what you're up against." Jacqueline stood tall, refusing to back down. The truth is on my side. You can't outrun it anymore. The whistleblower, Nina, she's not just some old Richard. She's been working with me. She's been feeding me information about everything you've been hiding. You thought you could use her to destroy me, but she was the one who turned the tables. The room fell silent as Jacqueline's words hung in the air. Richard's eyes widened, and for the first time since she'd entered the room, there was a flicker of panic in his expression. The facade was cracking, revealing the desperation beneath it. "You're lying," Richard spat, his voice rising now, filled with disbelief. "Nina would never betray me. She's loyal to me. She always has been." Jacqueline's lips curled into a tight smile. "Loyal? You mean to say she was willing to let you use her to manipulate me, to frame me for things I never did?" Richard recoiled, his fists clenching at his sides. He had underestimated Nina, just as he had underestimated Jacqueline. "What is it you want, then?" he demanded. "Money, pal. What's the point of all this?" "The point," Jacqueline said, her voice icy now, "is justice. It's about showing the world who you really are. The man who thinks he can get away with everything. The man who can destroy lives without a second thought. But not anymore, Richard. Not today." She slid a stack of documents toward him, and he hesitated before picking them up. His hands trembled as he scanned the pages, his face turning white with each passing second. The evidence was irrefutable. The offshore accounts, the illicit deals, the money laundering. It was all there, laid out in black and white. For a moment, Richard said nothing. His face was a mask of fury and disbelief. But Jacqueline could see it now, the realization that everything he had built, everything he had worked for, was crumbling around him. "You think this will end well for you?" Richard's voice was almost a whisper now, but there was no mistaking the threat in it. Jacqueline leaned forward, her eyes cold and resolute. "I think it's already over for you. You just don't know it yet." Before Richard could respond, the door to the boardroom swung open, and two men in suits walked in. They were the private investigators Jacqueline had hired weeks earlier, the ones who had been gathering the final pieces of evidence. With them, they brought the final nail in Richard's coffin: photographs, wiretaps, and recorded conversations that linked Richard to every illegal activity that had been uncovered. Richard's face went ashen as he realized the full scope of what was happening. The evidence was undeniable. It wasn't just a scandal. It was a criminal empire, and Jacqueline had exposed it. "You're finished," Jacqueline said softly, watching the man who had once seemed untouchable crumble before her. "The authorities will be here soon. You'll be held accountable for everything you've done." Richard took a step back, his eyes wild, his breath coming in sharp gasps. "You think you've won, but you don't understand. You'll never be able to escape what's coming next." Jacqueline felt a chill run down her spine, but this time she didn't flinch. She had fought for this moment, and now that it was here, she wasn't about to let anything, anyone, take it from her. As Richard was led away in handcuffs, Jacqueline stood at the head of the table, watching him go. The weight of the moment settled over her, but it didn't bring relief. It was over, but it wasn't the victory she had envisioned. The damage had been done, and the scars would remain. But she had won, and for the first time in months, Jacqueline allowed herself a breath, a moment of peace. It was over, but the journey had changed her. The woman who had walked into Silver Rock months ago was no longer the same. She was stronger now, battle-tested and wiser. As the doors to the boardroom closed, Jacqueline sat back in her chair, the quiet hum of the city outside filling the silence. Her battle was over, but the war for her soul was just beginning. The boardroom, once a battleground, now felt strangely silent. The sunlight filtered through the large windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor, but there was no warmth in it. The hum of the city outside seemed distant, muted, as if even the world beyond the walls of Silver Rock was holding its breath, waiting for the final act to unfold. Jacqueline sat at the head of the table, the weight of what had just transpired pressing down on her chest. Richard was gone, escorted out by the authorities, his empire of lies crumbling like a house of cards. The documents, the evidence, the tapes, it had all been enough to expose him, to finally put an end to his reign of corruption. But as Jacqueline stared at the empty chair where Richard had sat, something gnawed at her. It wasn't the victory she had imagined. She had thought that exposing Richard's treachery would bring relief, that the years of struggle and manipulation would culminate in a sense of justice, a sense of triumph. But there was no triumph here. There was only emptiness. Her fingers drummed lightly on the surface of the table as her thoughts wandered. The victory had cost her more than she had ever expected. She had trusted people, Ethan, Lisa, and now the walls felt closer, the room tighter. She had won, but in the process, she had lost parts of herself she hadn't even realized were important. The cost of winning had been steep. Ethan's face flashed in her mind. His betrayal had been the hardest part. She had known him for years, worked alongside him, shared countless moments of success. But that had all been a facade, a lie, just like Richard's carefully crafted empire. His actions had been a direct stab at her trust, and though she had exposed him, the emotional scar lingered. She had to believe that Ethan had acted out of fear, out of pressure. After all, he wasn't the only one who had been manipulated. But that didn't make the pain any less real. Lisa had been another disappointment. The woman who had promised loyalty, who had sworn by her side, had fallen into the same trap. Jacqueline's reflection in the glass table before her was a stranger, a woman who had once believed in the goodness of people, in the power of loyalty. She had wanted to believe in something, anything, that wasn't mired in betrayal. A soft knock on the door pulled Jacqueline out of her thoughts, and she looked up to find Nina standing in the doorway. The whistleblower, the woman who had turned the tide, who had helped Jacqueline uncover the truth about Richard. Her presence felt like a balm to Jacqueline's worn-out soul. It had been Nina who had given her the strength to keep going, who had been her silent ally in the shadows. Nina stepped into the room slowly, her posture still a little tentative, as if unsure of her place now that the battle was over. Jacqueline gestured for her to take a seat. "How are you holding up?" Nina asked quietly, her voice carrying a weight of its own, soft but full of meaning. Jacqueline sighed, her eyes falling to the floor as she tried to gather her thoughts. "I don't know. I thought I'd feel something more. Maybe relief. But I just feel hollow." Nina nodded, her gaze steady. "It's not over, you know. Richard's gone, but the consequences won't vanish overnight. There's still the public to reckon with, the media, the fallout. But you did what needed to be done." "I did," Jacqueline replied, her voice stronger now, but the doubt remained. "But at what cost? The people I trusted, they've betrayed me. And now what? I'm left with a company in ruins and a reputation that's been damaged almost beyond repair." Nina shifted in her seat, her gaze softening with understanding. "You've done something that most people wouldn't have the courage to do, Jacqueline. You've exposed the truth, no matter the price. It's going to hurt for a while, but this is your chance to rebuild. This time, you'll do it right. This time, you won't have to carry the weight of their lies." Jacqueline looked at Nina, the words sinking in. She had been so focused on the fight, so consumed by the need to win, that she hadn't fully considered what the aftermath would feel like. The emotional exhaustion was overwhelming. The thrill of the chase had faded, leaving only the sobering reality of what it took to bring the truth to light. She had won the battle, yes, but the scars of the war would be with her for a long time. "I never thought it would be like this," Jacqueline whispered, more to herself than to Nina. "I thought I was doing the right thing, but now, I'm not so sure." Nina leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "The right thing isn't always the easy thing, and sometimes the people you trust will hurt you. But that doesn't mean you've failed. It means you've seen the world for what it is, complicated, messy, full of flaws. But that doesn't make you any less of a person. It makes you human." Jacqueline nodded slowly, absorbing Nina's words. The truth was, she had always known that things weren't as simple as black and white, right and wrong. But it had never been so clear before, the blurry line between the two. She had fought for justice, but justice didn't always come neatly packaged. It wasn't always a victory that felt good. Sometimes, justice was just an end, not a beginning. "I don't know what comes next," Jacqueline said finally, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "I've fought so long to get here, but I'm not sure what to do with it now that it's all over. The company, my reputation, everything feels like it's been shattered." Nina gave her a soft, knowing smile. "The pieces are still there, Jacqueline. You just have to figure out how to put them back together." The weight of Nina's words hung in the air, and Jacqueline let out a slow breath, her shoulders sagging slightly. It would take time to rebuild, to heal. The wounds would take time to close. But she had learned something in this battle. Sometimes, the hardest truths were the ones that set you free, even if it didn't feel like it at first. As Jacqueline sat there in the dim light of the boardroom, the city bustling beyond the windows, she allowed herself a rare moment of vulnerability. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of everything she had lost, and yet, she still felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was something worth fighting for still. "I'll rebuild," she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. "I'll rebuild, and I'll do it better. This time, it won't be built on lies." The words felt like a promise to herself and to the future she was ready to face, no matter how uncertain it was. As the silence settled over the room, the weight of her decision settled in as well. It wasn't just the end of Richard's reign, the end of a corrupt empire. It was the end of the woman she had been. And, in its place, Jacqueline would forge something new, something stronger, something unbreakable. And that, she realized, was the only victory that mattered.